Last week, Taoiseach, the Competition and Consumer Protection Agency approved the acquisition of the Celtic Media Group by Independent News and Media. It's now up to the Minister with responsibility for communications and presumably the Cabinet to either accept or reject this acquisition. Earlier this year, a report authored by Dr Roddy Flynn of DCU identified Ireland as at high risk over its concentration of media ownership, and that was echoed by a report by the European Commission earlier this year. Indeed, they place Ireland at the highest level of concern and also identified the lack of legal barriers as an issue. Nessa Childers MEP held a conference earlier this year in which Dr Flynn's findings are reported, and more recently Lynn Boylan MEP commissioned an EU Parliament report. Its findings express similar grave concerns re the media landscape in Ireland. In that context, it is very difficult to see how an agency involved in consumer protection could approve such an acquisition, particularly in a sector that has the potential to undermine our democracy. INM publishes the Irish Independent, Sunday Independent, the Herald, the Sunday World, the Belfast Telegraph, 50% of the Daily Star and 13 paid-for regional weeklies. If the Celtic acquisition goes ahead, that will become 28 regional titles across the country in addition to the nationals. That, in addition to the radio share where Communicore, a company owned by the same majority shareholder of INM, controls News Talk, Today FM, 98 FM, Spin 103, Spin South West, roughly 20% of the entire radio market. While print media and broadcasting are different, it's essential that the cross-ownership, Taoiseach, of INM and Communicore are considered in tandem. In 2002, the Competition Act, as you know, does not allow competition restrictions on media ownership to be retrospective, which raises further questions about permitting this acquisition. If there is already a problem with the over-concentration of media ownership, the obvious question is, why would you make that situation worse? While media concentration is an issue in its own right, the ownership of such a large proportion of our print, broadcasting and digital media by someone who has consistently used the courts to create a chilling effect on journalists and other media outlets has to be questioned in the most serious of terms. The same person, Denis O'Brien, was also subject of the adverse findings, as you know, in the Moriarty Tribunal. If this media acquisition, Taoiseach, is clearly against the public interest, it's essential that vested interests are not once again placed ahead of the public interest. I want to ask you two questions, Taoiseach. Will you oppose this acquisition? And the second question is, given the changing nature of media, would you support the call by the NUJ to initiate a public commission on the future of the media, which would examine not just ownership, but editorial control, employment standards, including pension rights, measures to protect editorial independence, and whether the state supports may be appropriate to ensure a diversity of media ownership across all platforms?
Taoiseach.
No, I don't support that call, Deputy Murphy. This report was commissioned by MEP Boylan and was based on a legal opinion from two firms based in London and in Belfast, and both of the firms primarily work in the field of human rights. And the report seems to have been prompted in part by the 2015 report of the Centre for Media Pluralism and Media Freedom, which is a centre based in Florida and funded by the European Commission. That was published back in March of 2016. I think everybody can agree that in a free and pluralistic media is an essential component of a modern democracy. The report that you mentioned is being examined by the Minister for Communications on the basis of his responsibility for media plurality. I understand that he is to answer questions in the House here tomorrow on that. In addition to operating the media mergers regime provided for in the revised Competition Act of 2012, the Department of Communication does engage with the European Commission and the Council of Europe on all issues relating to media freedom and plurality. It is also important to say to you, Deputy Murphy, that many of the issues and the conclusions raised in the report were actually debated in the House here during the passage of the Competition and Consumer Protection Act of 2014, which revised the Competition Act of 2002. And as you are aware, the 2014 Act gives the Minister for Communications the power to block any media merger that is deemed likely to be contrary to the public interest in maintaining the plurality of media in the state, and therefore I don't see any reason for the setting up of a commission of inquiry into the matter. The Act did not give the Minister the power to act retrospectively and to assess a media business in the absence of a proposed merger, as to do so would be to interfere with the property rights enshrined in Article 43 of Bunreacht na hÉireann, which would raise a myriad of legal complexities. So simply stating that it is legally possible to do so does not address any of these legal complexities that are involved, or it doesn't recognise the effect that such a move could have on the freedom of expression and investment in the sector. And in fact, the report itself recognises that this is, as they call it, an extremely difficult area, Count Corla, that would raise issues regarding property rights, market effects, procedural fairness and freedom of expression considerations.
Murphy.
Taoiseach, I'm not entirely sure what to make of that response. The Constitution certainly does include a section on property rights, but all rights have to be balanced. And indeed, the section in the Constitution is balanced by a second section which deals with the common good. And essentially, there's no reason why you would make matters worse, is the point I'm making, where there's already a demonstrated difficulty with the over-concentration of media ownership. Why you would do that when retrospection is in fact not permitted, according to yourself, although I think that that is something that is open to challenge in the courts. If we look at rural areas, Taoiseach, and I don't need to give you any kind of a description of rural areas, but the more concentrated the media ownership gets in rural areas, the less obviously informed people are going to become. But what's been proposed is that the current CEO of Celtic Media would become the MD of all 28 INM regional titles. And you have things like, for example, the possibility of cross-selling of advertising. You have, the potential of people in rural areas not being able to go into Easons, for example, and pick up alternative newspapers. So I think the retrospection aspect, Taoiseach, is one that must be taken very seriously. Taoiseach, do you oppose this merger yourself, or this acquisition yourself? What is your view on the acquisition of the Celtic Media Group?
Thank you. Taoiseach.
I misinformed you in the sense that the Minister is not here tomorrow. Actually, he's with the climate business in Marrakesh, and it's the Minister for Education who had a swap arrangement with questions tomorrow, so that's why he's not here. Obviously, the most important of the considerations that are involved here would be the potential impact on media freedom if a government minister would effectively have the power to break up a media business at any time, and that could also have a severe impact on investment in the sector. So the issues were debated here during the Act of 2014. The assertion that there are no representatives being made on the MSI-MED committee, and that none of the independent experts on the body are based in Ireland, is misleading. That committee is a subcommittee of the larger steering committee on media and information society, and obviously there is a principal officer of the department who sits on that as well. So the Minister, given the fact that all these things were discussed already in the review of the Act, does not see the basis upon which a commission of investigation or a commission of inquiry will be based into this, and he doesn't have the power to act retrospectively, as I pointed out.
We now proceed